should begin this show by doing an invocation to the blessed virus. We should say, like, in the name of the virus and of the holy infection, amen. Maybe that could be one of our highlight shows, is that little prayer right there.
Well, the camera's rolling, so maybe that'll
So
make it
there
on
you
the
go.
main video.
It can be one of those, like, funny outtakes or whatever.
Well, on that note,
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. You know how Muslims begin every prayer with, like, in the name of Allah, the great, magnificent, etc., etc. So, which is a heresy, because that's a false religion. So, I mean, equally, you could begin in the name of the holy virus and its blessed infection or whatever.
well, did you see the video where in Ireland the one Catholic priest let the Muslim
I heard
sing
about
his prayer
that.
during
yeah,
Mass
I
or
heard
something?
about that.
Yeah, I saw that video and I'm like, man, that's crazy. They banned the Catholics from the Mass, and now they're inviting a Mohammedan to preach his
Mohammedan, yeah.
heresy. And
In the Catholic Church.
yeah, I don't know.
You can't have the Mass, but the Muslim cleric can pray in your church.
All right, well,
Welcome
welcome to the Thunder and Lightning
Hey.
Show. We're gonna do some
Can that
clarification.
camera see me?
Yeah, it
Yeah,
can. It's got a big wide zoom.
Okay.
All are welcome, everyone.
Yes.
We're gonna do a little bit of clarification on obedience. We talked about obedience for a while the last show, and this I just had just several questions to ask Ryan, and several situations, scenarios, and you can take it wherever you want. But the first scenario, I complained about a bishop from Boise, Idaho, who banned Mass Ad Orientum. So under obedience, is he able to do that? Like, is there a way where a bishop can say, like, no, that's ridiculous?
No, I don't think he can, and the reason why is because things proper to the Mass itself, like that, would be regulated by a liturgical book and the Holy See and tradition as well. So, according to the tradition, Mass was always celebrated ad Orientum, which doesn't necessarily mean not facing the people, because in some of the Roman basilicas, actually, the traditional posture was that the Pope faced east, or the bishop or whoever was saying Mass in these basilicas faced east, which happens to be where the people are. But the thing is, though, they weren't celebrating towards the people, and another interesting thing is that when it became time for the consecration at the Mass, that the people would all turn around. Or another thing that had been done in various churches was they would close a veil, and so what was going on at the altar was then veiled from the people.
Oh, wow.
Which was actually a tradition even in England and in Northern Europe. This thing existed until probably, I think, after the Reformation or shortly before. They did away with these veils, this curtain that would close off the sanctuary. So it was kind of like an extension of, you know how in the East they have the Iconostasis. In the West, we had temporary curtains that we would close during the canon of the Mass, and then they would be opened up at the end of the canon.
The iconostasis, they're gates, right? And
Well, yeah.
For the people who are not familiar
Not
with the
familiar
Eastern
the East,
tradition,
yeah.
and you can look that up on YouTube. There's a lot of Byzantine divine liturgies online right now.
Yeah, it's basically like a wall covered with icons, and it separates the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary, from the place where the people are. And there's 3 doors in it. There's the royal door, which only the priest goes through, and then there's 2 other side doors, which the deacon and servers and various other clerics go through those doors. But they have that in the East, and similarly in the West, we have an altar rail, and before we also had these curtains that would close at various points in time. Because you're veiling the sacred, as Taylor Marshall pointed out on one of his recent shows. I believe it was the one where he talked with Timothy Flanders about the pre-55 Holy Week. They talked about veiling as it existed in the old liturgy. Everything's veiled. The tabernacle is veiled. The priest is veiled. Various other things in the Mass are veiled. Back to your question about, can a bishop forbid the ad Orientum? So it's allowed by it's the tradition. It is allowed by the liturgical books. It's actually presumed by the liturgical books, because the question was asked to Cardinal Sarah when he was head of the Congregation for Divine Worship about that particular posture. And then even the new Mass, it presupposes that the priest is not facing the people. And so then as far as like the canon law, there's nothing in there about that. So I don't think that there's any power that the bishop has to forbid an Ad Orientum posture. I don't think it's possible because it's traditional. It's been it's been said by Rome that it's certainly permissible, and it's even implicitly the norm in the new missal. So I don't think that the bishop has power to do that. So I think that therefore such an edict by a bishop doesn't fall under obedience because it's not founded on law or rightful authority.
Now the bishop can take away the priest's faculties to say Mass in that diocese, right?
He could do that, but he needs a just cause because, again, we're a church of laws, so it has to be based on some grave reason. I mean, a priest isn't just like the dog that you take away his bone when he chews up the newspaper. He's a priest of God, of the Catholic Church. And so therefore, according to the law, according to canon law, he has rights. And you can only take away those rights for certain things. So it's not like, Father Smith, I told you to bring me a venti latte, and I wanted it with this particular accoutrement, and you forgot this. You forgot the crumpet. You're suspended, Father Smith. I never want to see you in my diocese again. You'll be saying Mass in the basement until the day you die, Father Smith. So a bishop can't do that because he just can't suspend willy-nilly. It has to be something legitimate, like this priest, stole. He has a mistress. He molested. He said Mass drunk. All these things. These are all enumerated by canon law, so it's got to be there.
On a similar note, can a bishop forbid priests to say a Latin Mass in the diocese? Now I know this is kind of like a conflict in certain ways because I talked to a diocesan priest a while ago, and he primarily says the Novus Ordo because that's what he's assigned to do. And he made references to Morum Pontificum, which is Pope Benedict's, is it an encyclical or just a directive?
It's something called a Motu Proprio, so it's lower level. It's just him setting out an edict.
Basically, what he said was, priests can say the Latin Mass, and that's pretty much it. And he gives the rights of the faithful, where he says the faithful have a right to request the Mass from their pastor, and the pastor should tend to the concerns of the people. So it's basically saying priest, if faithful requests the Latin Mass, then the priest should try to accommodate them the best he can. Yeah. Now, the bishops
can't.
If he can't, a lot of them don't know the Latin Mass.
Yeah,
in
so
the first place. So
the Motu Proprio then talks about what you do if the priest can't accommodate.
And I don't know that.
Well, it says that basically you should go to the bishop, and the bishop should try to find a priest and make some assignment and make accommodation for them. This is what the Motu Proprio says.
So that was in 2007, I believe.
Yes, 2007.
This priest was talking about how they have certain Mass times scheduled on Sundays, and so the bishop certainly wouldn't want them to remove a Novus Ordo and replace it with the Latin Mass, which in my opinion I would replace all Novus Ordos with Latin Masses, and I'm sure Ryan as well. But
you don't want to disturb people's piety.
Yeah, that makes
don't do more harm than good.
Yeah, I mean that would be that's why I'm not a bishop. But I think I don't think it would really hurt things to add an additional Sunday Mass as a Latin Mass or even a weekday Latin Mass. So do bishops have the right to regulate that? If a priest says, okay, I already say 2 Sunday Masses, I'm just going to say this 1:00 p.m. Latin Mass on a Sunday, or a 7 p.m. Mass on a Wednesday night or something. Does a bishop have a right to regulate that?
Yeah, this is something that's interesting. Before I address that, let's go back to the Motu Proprio. So this comes from the highest authority in the Church, the Pope, and it says that any priest can say the Old Missal without needing any permission from his bishop. Okay, so that's enshrined in the law. Any priest can say this Old Missal. I think it might say whenever you want, at any time. Now, that fits within the general law of the Church. So the general law of the church, and this is where we get into your question and it becomes more nuanced. So the bishop, according to canon law, a priest is only supposed to say one mass a day. And it's only by the bishop's permission that he's able to celebrate 2 or 3 or more masses on Sundays and holy days for the sake of the faithful, so that they can hear mass and fulfill their Sunday obligation. Now the situation becomes a bishop also, I believe, has some responsibility, has some authority, has some oversight on the Sunday Mass schedule in parishes. I know that in this diocese, the bishop wants to know, the chancery wants to know if you're adding a Sunday Mass or if you're subtracting. Doesn't matter whether it's new Mass, old Mass, clown Mass, balloon Mass, doesn't matter. He wants to know. Because according to the law, according to the canon law, the bishop needs to be apprised of this thing and be aware of the whole 9 yards. So the question then becomes, well, if the priest decides, hey, I want to add this Latin Mass to my Sunday schedule, then the bishop can get involved and say, I don't want you to add a Mass, period. Or he can say, I don't want you to add a Latin Mass. Well, that introduces another question. Is he allowed to discriminate? If you say to the bishop, maybe the priest would be in better shape if he said, didn't even say anything to the bishop and just said, I'm switching one of these Novus Ordos over to the Latin Mass. Because I'm not going to ask him for an additional Mass, and he won't let me take one away, and I don't need any permission to say the Latin Mass, so I'm just going to switch one of these over. I'm not sure. Maybe Summorum Pontificum implies that that you can say this Mass in private, whenever you want, but public, you have to go see the bishop. I don't know, but that seems to me, if you read the intention of Summorum Pontificum, the intention is the Pope is to allow any priest to say the old Mass at any time he wants, but he just has to be pastoral about this and not upset people's routine and their piety. If you've got your baby boomers who have been going to this Novus Ordo for 50 years and they really do like it, and there's no danger of the faith here, although we've been over this before. If you're giving communion in the hand, there's objectively sacrilege going on there. But let's say we've got a unicorn Novus Ordo.
Father Heilman's parish.
Yeah, so you've got a unicorn Novus Ordo with no outrages or sacrileges going on. And in that case, it seems to me, my opinion is, it would be a bad idea to upset that apple cart without a really good reason and replace it with an old Mass. So, it seems to me justified that the bishop would want to have some control over this, to be in charge and to be the spiritual father of the diocese.
Yeah, and I actually had a Novus Ordo priest confirm to me what you said about a priest can say the Latin Mass whenever they want. He said he could say, he said that he did not know the Latin Mass.
Mm-hmm.
He did not know how to say the Latin Mass, but if he wanted, he could say the Latin Mass on any Sunday that he wanted to.
Okay.
So I did.
Checked that.
He did. His statement confirmed what you said. So.
And I know a priest who's recently begun celebrating the old Mass before we got shut down by the virus. And this priest is saying the Mass privately during the suspension caused by the virus. And, it's a lot easier to do this stuff. Well, now that you have the virus, there's nobody there. Every Mass is private. But it's a lot easier for a priest to get started by saying the old Mass on a weekday, because the bishop doesn't need to know about adding a Mass on a certain day, or you can change the time of a weekday Mass and move it to the evening and say, okay, this is now Latin Mass. It's something that the bishop in many dioceses is not involved in, and it's not a big deal. In a lot of places, the bishop doesn't care. And, you're free also as a priest to say, all these weekday Masses are private now. They're all going to be at 8 o'clock, and the doors will be unlocked, and you can attend or not attend. They're not on the schedule, but they're all going to be the Latin Mass, the Old Mass, and I think that's something that a priest could do.
All right, changing gears a little bit. So going back to obedience.
Oh yeah.
If a priest is teaching, he's preaching from the pulpit about Pachamama, he's saying this is a disgrace,
Mm-hmm.
this is an abomination, or he defines the church as teaching on marriage, one man and one woman, and a bishop takes offense to it and says, under obedience, I order you not to preach on this topic. Can the bishop do that?
He, specifically about a certain topic that's a part of the Catholic faith, no. Because when a priest is given the faculties to preach, he is given the faculties to preach the Catholic faith. And so part of the Catholic faith is to condemn idols and idolatry, and part of the Catholic faith is to teach marriage between a man and a woman that is indissoluble until death do us part. And so that is when the bishop gives over the powers to preach to priests, which is actually different. There's like a certificate. When a priest is ordained, he gets 2 permissions. Maybe there's 3. But let's go through all these permissions, which may be in one document or in separate documents. But one is he's given the authority and the ability to celebrate Mass in public. He's given the authority to preach. And he's given the authority to go to the confession and hear confessions and forgive sins. So the bishop has the authority to regulate those things. And as I said, once he gives the power, he can only take it away for a very good reason. It's clearly delineated by the canon law. But a bishop doesn't have the power to say, Father John, you are not allowed to preach about the Trinity anymore, because I am a heretic and I disagree with the Trinity. I believe that there's only one person in God. I'm a Unitarian, and so nobody is allowed to preach about the Trinity. They just have to say God, not talk about the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, period, in these sermons. So you can't. A bishop is not free to do that because that's part of the Catholic faith. Now, a bishop could say, you are not allowed to preach about Medjugorje anymore, because that is not part of the Catholic faith. That is something that is not quasi, I don't know what the status of Medjugorje is.
Well, Pope Francis did kind of upgrade the status.
Yeah, so
we're getting into private revelation, which no private revelation is really approved until it's approved by a bishop, and until usually it has to be done, like the apparitions have to be done, and
finished.
then
And
several years later.
Although Medjugorje was stopped because of the virus, so it's too dangerous for the people to go out. It's too dangerous for Our Lady to appear, and so the virus has shut down the apparitions in Medjugorje. But a bishop could say, you're not allowed to preach about Medjugorje. You're not allowed to preach about this seer or that seer. I think a bishop could also tell you, if there was some disputed point about Catholic doctrine, I think that a bishop could tell a priest, I don't want you talking about that because it's not, it's creating all these divisions, and this isn't even a church teaching. I mean, maybe if it, like, say, the assumption of Joseph into heaven. Let's say you were 24/7 preaching the Assumption of St. Joseph. And the bishop is like, man, this stuff, just preach about what's in the Gospels and talk about marriage or, things like that, raising your children in Catholic faith. And man, Father John, every sermon is about the Assumption of St. Joseph. So I think he could tell you to stop preaching about the Assumption of St. Joseph.
Yeah, that's questionable.
Yeah, that's pious. I mean, some theologians and saints taught and believed in the Assumption of St. Joseph. But if you take this stuff to extremes and it's not like clearly a Catholic teaching, and I think the bishop could tell you in that case, stop talking about that.
Yeah, and with Medjugorje, I think that's going to be a controversial topic, because I know a lot of people that
Yeah.
have strong opinions either way. So
And if, you know, just do whatever the church says with these revelations.
yeah,
Is it against the faith? Well, then it's got to be rejected. If it's ambiguous and ambivalent, then you know you choose whatever you want to choose and listen to what the bishops have said. But I've heard that many bishops condemned the thing. Many of the diocesan bishops said that thing's a fraud, and then some other bishop says it kept being examined by the Pope, and now I don't know what the situation is, if it's tolerated or I don't know.
Pope Francis, he named it like a place of pilgrimage, and then so
Okay.
that actually further adds to the confusion.
Well, but the thing is that I know people who went to Medjugorje and their faith was strengthened by that, not only laity but priests. Then I've had
Yeah.
people who have condemned the thing and said it's terrible. Like, I think E. Michael Jones wrote a couple exposés about Medjugorje, and other priests have said it's just bad. There's bad stuff going on there. You have priests who are, like, there's some Franciscans there who went renegade and started disobeying their bishop because he said don't do anything about Medjugorje, and that's their whole apostolate is this, and so they disobeyed. So it becomes a point of contention, and
Yeah,
that's
now,
all I can say about it.
and now we're getting back into obedience.
Obedience, yeah.
Well, speaking of that, do you have like distinctions of obedience that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, this is something that this just popped into my head yesterday. And the reason why this came up is because I was thinking about Archbishop Lefebvre and the fact that he was materially disobedient to the Pope as far as consecrating other bishops
Now,
for
he's
the
a-
Society of St. Pius X. Archbishop Lefebvre was a retired bishop of I think Dakar. He was an Archbishop of Dakar
Which
in
is
Africa.
Africa, yeah.
Yeah, it's in Senegal, I think. So it's
Yeah.
French-speaking Africa. Archbishop Lefebvre in the 50s or 60s was the apostolic delegate to all French-speaking Africa, a high position in the church. He was at some point in time was the Superior General of the Holy Ghost Fathers, who were a missionary society that evangelized Africa. They did tremendous work. They had baptized so many idol worshippers and animists and pagans and, you know, basically the stuff that you see going on in the Amazon Synod. The Holy Ghost Fathers went in and preached against that and baptized people and got them to stop that witchcraft and sorcery and, you know, idolatry.
Killing people.
Yeah, killing people, like rituals and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sacrifices to false gods. So, Archbishop Lefebvre got permission from a local bishop to found a priestly society, the Society of St. Pius X in Switzerland. And there's a long story about that. But anyway, so that society was suppressed, in most people's opinion, unjustly. And so, the point being about this is some people make the argument in rhetoric, in writing, in polemics, in apologetics, and they'll say, well, Archbishop Lefebvre, he disobeyed the Pope over this consecration of bishops and run the Society of St. Pius X, and that was bad. And we should look at the great example of Saint Padre Pio, who he listened to his superiors and he took a suspension and went and hid in his hole and did what the bishop said to do. And then later the suspension was removed and he was restored to proper faculties and he's now a canonized saint. So they'll pit the example of Saint Padre Pio against the example of Archbishop Lefebvre. And they'll say Lefebvre should have done what Saint Pio did, and so Lefebvre was wrong. And I was thinking about this, and I said, this really isn't that good of a comparison, because though in the aspect of there was a command from a superior that said, don't do this thing, the thing was actually different. So the command, it was obedience. The command was given in obedience, but the object of the obedience was two different things, and I think people miss out on this and they clump it all together as if all obediences are the same, and they're not. And how do I explain this? This is how. So St. Padre Pio was accused of being like a charlatan, and somebody accused him of like seducing a woman in a confessional or whatever. So that was the accusations, and that he was like faking stigmata and visions and whatnot. And so he said, okay, this thing's crazy. We need to forget this. This is a sideshow. So Pio, Father Pio, you are not hearing confessions anymore. You are not preaching, and you're not saying Mass in public. So you have to go into a chapel, and we're keeping you out of the public eye. And we're doing that because we need to investigate, and we heard that you're approaching women in the confessional, that you're fraudulently doing these stigmata and visions and whatnot. So, St. Pio was never accused of teaching heresies or things wrong against the faith, or he wasn't being persecuted because he was Catholic, because he had the faith, because he said the Mass, because he heard confessions. He was being persecuted because there were accusations that he was being a fraudster, abusing the sacraments, putting on a show for his own, popularity or whatever, possessed by the devil. These are the kind of allegations. So the bishops, in the aspect of protecting the faith and the sacraments and not deceiving people, said, for a temporary time, you go and do your thing in a hole in the back of the monastery, friary, and do your thing there. You're only suspended publicly, but everything's okay. Now that is one thing. Now contrast that with what was going on with Archbishop Lefebvre, where they said, well, we're going to suspend you because you won't say the new Mass, and instead you say the old Mass. We're going to suspend you and your society because you're teaching from old textbooks, the kind of which that were used from the Council of Trent up until the 1950s. You're using this same method of priestly formation, and you won't accept the new method of priestly formation. Or you're teaching things like the Catholic Church is the one true faith outside of which nobody at all is saved, and that therefore the Protestants and Eastern Orthodox and Jews and Muslims are outside of that, and so they're in bad shape and they need to enter in to be saved. But we now, in the authorities, we want you to teach something else, like this new thing that supposedly came from Vatican II, that says that we're all in this church together, even atheists are part of this mystical body of Christ, etc., etc. So they asked Archbishop Lefebvre actually to not teach the Catholic faith and to not celebrate the traditional Mass. And so when you do that, you're no longer wielding proper authority anymore, and you're asking a different kind of obedience, because principally the obedience of the priest and the bishop is to teach the faith and offer the sacraments of the church. And so they more or less said to Archbishop Lefebvre, we don't want you to teach the Catholic faith anymore. We want you to teach a fake faith. We don't want you to celebrate the sacraments of the Catholic Church. We want you to celebrate these imposter, made up rites, the Novus Ordo rites. And furthermore, as a bishop, Archbishop Lefebvre is like, well, if I stop celebrating this old Mass, if I stop teaching the traditional faith, then it's going to look like the tradition and the Catholic faith are forbidden. And I can't let that happen, because there's nobody else out there who is teaching keeping the old Mass alive, forming priests according to the old way. And so Archbishop Lefebvre realized that if it was just him, if it was like, Archbishop Lefebvre, I want you to go only celebrate Mass in a closet from now on, but your priest and the faith the old Mass is allowed to continue, your fight against modernism is allowed to continue, he would have done it. But they didn't ask him to do that. They asked him to shut down the whole thing and not allow this traditional formation in the old Mass to continue. So the point being here that the objects of the obedience are different. In the case of St. Padre Pio, it was St. Padre Pio in himself as a priest, hearing confessions, saying Mass, having the stigmata. In the case of Archbishop Lefebvre, it wasn't about him. It was about the priestly society of St. Pius X and the faith and the traditional method of formation. So, as I said, if they had asked Archbishop Lefebvre to go say Mass only in a hole and appoint another superior of the Society of St. Pius X, who teaches the faith, who celebrates the Old Mass, he would have done it. But he saw that the whole thing was a trick to try to suppress the traditional Catholic liturgy and formation of priests. And so he knew, then therefore, because the object of obedience was not him as a person, but the object of obedience had to do with the faith itself, that he could not obey those commands. And so what I want to stress there is there's an obedience that ends in the person, and then there's an obedience that extends towards the faith itself and to the justice due to the church, to the tradition, to God. And so an authority can command you, as I don't think I mentioned this to you, but I was thinking about this, maybe I wrote it in a comment somewhere, is that the bishop can command, if you're a priest, or let's say you're a religious, and your superior says, Brother Father John, I want you to wear a clown nose all day long and put ashes on your head. Let's just stick with the clown nose. So you're wearing a clown nose all day. And under holy obedience, you wear the clown nose because that obedience begins and ends in yourself, and that's for your own humility. But you can't, because of the dignity of the liturgy of the church, you can't continue to wear that clown nose during Mass. If you're saying Mass, you have to take off the clown nose and put on the vestments. So, because now you're doing something greater than you, which is the liturgy of the church. And so, in a similar way, the bishop can say to you, you're only saying Mass in a closet, okay? Because I heard some things about you. But the bishop can't say, like, nobody is allowed to say Mass, and nobody's allowed to say the Mass anymore. I mean, he can say nobody can say the Mass in public. Well, at least that's what they're doing now. Are they allowed? I don't know. It seems fishy to me. It's just this blanket condemnation. But in the sense that, and a better example would be like, you're not allowed to preach about the Trinity anymore. Okay, this is the exact parallel, because that touches on the faith itself. Or you're not allowed to celebrate the Latin Mass. Now we know. I mean, Pope Benedict told us that any edicts that came from bishops or popes that said you can't celebrate the Old Mass were bogus. So anybody who resisted and refused to say the new Mass, although they were called schismatic, although they were called outside the church, although they were called not in step with Vatican II, we learned from Pope Benedict that they actually were within the church, they were within their rights, and they were not apparently out of step with Vatican II, and that all was fine. So everybody was wrong. Like, every bishop was wrong, and Pope Paul VI was wrong. Pope Benedict told us that they were all wrong. So he justified the position of Archbishop Lefebvre in Summorum Pontificum, that even the highest authority in the church cannot forbid what is the tradition of the church. And if you resist that, that's not disobedience, because the obedience is due to the Catholic faith, the obedience is due to the tradition, the obedience is due to the Catholic Church, and it's not if the will of an individual pope and the tyranny of an individual pope contradicts the tradition or the teaching magisterium of the church, then it should be disobeyed. And I think that's the essence here. Make a distinction between the objects of those obedience, of the commands that were given to St. Pio versus the commands that were given to Archbishop Lefebvre.
Yeah, and that's a good point, that Jesus is bigger than anything else. Like, Jesus is God, and obedience to Jesus supersedes obedience to any human. I think that's basically the overall.
Correct, and we know how to be obedient to Jesus from what the Catholic Church and the magisterium has taught. So don't be confused here and think like, oh, this is Protestant, that I got some teaching or something that didn't come from the church. No, it's because I have the church and I have the faith and I can read it that I know what Jesus wants to do. The point is that there's this guy over here who has a pointy hat and a stick, and he's telling me to not do what all his predecessors did and not teach what the church taught and to change everything. And that's not obedience to Christ anymore. That's not obedience to the church. That would be going along with some usurper and his plans to like do some kind of coup and take over the church. So that's the point. What looks like disobedience and disrespect to lawful authority is actually in itself obedience and respect for lawful authority.
It's not so easy as just saying, well, my superior told me to do this, so I'm going to do it, just because Simon
It's not that easy.
Simon
it's not Simon
says.
says.
So do you have any closing thoughts?
No, this is a really good thing. There's much to be thought about and things to be discussed. And, I'm glad that you asked these questions because they're really good. I'm glad I could say whatever I could say about them.
Yeah, hopefully that was a good overview. I know this is our second show on obedience. I mean, if we think of more stuff, maybe we'll do another show.
And
But
if you have questions or objections, then please let those out there.
yeah, I'm always
like to
glad
hear
to
them.
have people comment on the videos, and I know there's some people sometimes that disagree with us, which is pretty interesting. But
It's fine.
whatever, we like to hear your opinions.
If you disagree with us and think we're stupid, then you must share this video with 10 other people. And then that way everybody will know how crazy and stupid we are. But then we'll also get increased viewership, so...
All right, thank you so much for watching.
Peace.